In the year 797 AD, in the sacred palace of Constantinople, the Empress Irene had her own son blinded. She chose the same room where she herself had given birth to him 26 years earlier. She chose it deliberately. Constantine VI was removed from power, his eyes destroyed so that he could never rule again. Byzantine political tradition held that a physically imperfect man could not be emperor, and Irene took his title. Not empress consort. Not empress mother. Emperor. Basileus. The masculine title, without modification, because she had decided that no feminine form of the word was adequate to what she intended to be. She was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire as sole monarch in her own name. She had done so by removing every obstacle between herself and the throne, including the son she had once fought to protect. She held power alone for 5 years before a palace coup sent her into exile on the island of Lesbos, where she died the following year. She was later canonized by the Eastern Orthodox Church as a saint. This is Irene of Athens, regent, empress, saint, and the woman who blinded her own child to take his crown. The Orthodox Church's ability to hold all of these things simultaneously in the category of sanctity is, in itself, a statement about the complexity of the world she inhabited. Athens to Constantinople, an unlikely beginning. Almost nothing is known about Irene's origins before she arrived in Constantinople in 769 AD as a bride for the 17-year-old co-emperor Leo IV. She was from Athens, hence the epithet, the Athenian, by which she is known to history, and her family appears to have been of local Greek nobility, neither the wealthiest nor the most politically connected class in the empire. How she came to the attention of the imperial court is not recorded. Byzantine chronicles occasionally mention that brides for emperors were selected through a form of bride show, an assembly of candidates from across the empire evaluated for beauty, education, and character, but whether Irene came to Constantinople through this process or through some other channel is unknown. What is known is that she was chosen, that she arrived in Constantinople in December 769, that she converted from whatever local Christianity she practiced to the Chalcedonian Orthodoxy of the Imperial Church, and that she married Leo IV the following year. She was probably in her late teens. She entered a court dominated by the iconoclast theological position, the conviction that the veneration of religious images was idolatry. That her father-in-law Constantine V had enforced with considerable violence, destroying icons, persecuting monks, and closing monasteries across the empire. She was personally opposed to iconoclasm from the beginning, though she was careful not to say so openly while her husband lived. Iconoclasm, the theological war behind the politics. To understand Irene's significance, you have to understand what iconoclasm was and why it mattered so intensely to Byzantium. The controversy over religious images, whether the veneration of icons of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints constituted legitimate devotion or idolatrous worship forbidden by the Second Commandment, had divided the Byzantine Church and state since the Emperor Leo III issued an edict against images in 726. His son Constantine V had pursued the policy with particular ferocity, convening a council in 754 that condemned image veneration and had himself celebrated as the 13th apostle, who had purified the church. The theological stakes were genuine and the political ones were enormous. The monasteries, which were the primary producers and defenders of icons, were also the primary repositories of education, charity, and independent theological authority in Byzantine society. The iconoclast emperor's attacks on monasteries were attacks on institutional power as much as on theology. The monks who resisted and suffered, some were tortured, some executed, some had their beards burned, became the heroes of the icon-venerating party, whose base was in the western provinces, in Rome, and among the ordinary population of Constantinople, where the veneration of images was deeply embedded in daily religious practice. Irene was a convinced icon venerator. Whether this conviction was primarily theological or primarily political, a means of building alliances with the monastic party and with Rome against the iconoclast military establishment, is impossible to separate cleanly. The conviction was real, the political utility was also real. The two were not in contradiction. The regency, power without the title. Leo IV died in 780, after a reign of 5 years, leaving Irene as regent for their 9-year-old son Constantine VI. She was 30 years old, a widow with a child emperor, in a court staffed by iconoclast generals and officials who had no interest in seeing a woman hold real power and no theological sympathy for the direction she intended to take the empire. Her management of the regency in the first years was politically sophisticated. She moved slowly, building alliances, removing iconoclast officials gradually and replacing them with men whose loyalty she had reason to trust. She co-opted the military by distributing patronage and avoiding the foreign policy adventures that might expose her to military failure. And she began the process of reversing the theological policy of the previous 2 reigns. The instrument she used was a general council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which met at Nicaea in 787 and would be known to history as the Second Council of Nicaea. Convening an ecumenical council was an act of imperial authority of the highest order, requiring negotiation with Rome, the Eastern Patriarchates, and the domestic episcopate. Irene managed all of this from the regency position, technically ruling in her son's name, in practice ruling in her own right. The council condemned iconoclasm, restored the veneration of images, and rehabilitated the monks and clergy who had been persecuted under the iconoclast emperors. It was the most significant theological achievement of Irene's reign, and it was accomplished while she was still officially only a regent. The Second Council of Nicaea, Theology as Power. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 is one of the 7 ecumenical councils recognized as authoritative by both the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, the last council recognized as ecumenical by both traditions before the Great Schism of 1054. Its convening and its outcome were Irene's work, and their significance extended far beyond the theological question it decided. The practical challenge of convening the council was considerable. The previous iconoclast council of 754 had produced bishops who were now theologically compromised. Rome, whose popes had consistently opposed iconoclasm and been in intermittent conflict with Constantinople over the question, needed to be brought on board in a way that preserved Byzantine autonomy while acknowledging papal theological authority. The Eastern Patriarchates, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, were under Arab rule and could send only representatives, not the patriarchs themselves. Irene navigated all of this through a combination of diplomatic correspondence, the strategic deployment of the Patriarch Teresios, a layman she had elevated to the Patriarchate specifically for this purpose, a brilliant legal and theological mind, and the management of the council's procedures to produce a predetermined conclusion while maintaining the appearance of genuine deliberation. The iconoclast bishops who had been ordained under the previous regime were received back into communion without being required to recant their ordinations, a compromise that the stricter monks found scandalous but that was politically necessary to prevent a schism with the domestic episcopate. The council's theological definition, that images could be venerated but not worshipped, the distinction between proskynesis, veneration, and latria, worship, was a precise and carefully calibrated resolution of the controversy that gave both sides something. The icon venerators had their images restored, and the iconoclasts could argue that the council had not endorsed idolatry. The definition has remained the standard position of both the Catholic and Orthodox churches on the question ever since. Irene produced it from the position of a regent, a woman with no formal theological authority. Through the skillful manipulation of a process that was, formally, controlled by men. Constantine VI and the struggle for sole power. As Constantine VI grew into adulthood, the natural tension between a mother who had held real power for a decade and a son who intended to exercise the authority his title gave him became an organizing conflict of Byzantine politics. Constantine VI was not without ability, he was capable militarily and had his own political ambitions. But he was temperamentally volatile and repeatedly made decisions that undermined his position. His first attempt to assert independence, around 790, succeeded. A military revolt in favor of the young emperor removed Irene from power and forced her into a subordinate position. She accepted the demotion and waited. Within 2 years, Constantine VI had alienated the military with a humiliating defeat against the Bulgarians, alienated the church by divorcing his wife Maria and marrying his mistress Theodote, a union condemned by the influential monk Theodore of Staudios as adulterous, and alienated the popular party by his general political ineptitude. He had given his opponents everything they needed. Irene moved carefully. She cultivated the officials and courtiers who had reasons to prefer her rule to his. She maintained contact with the monastic networks that had been her allies since the Council of 787. She waited for the moment when her son's position was weak enough that her intervention would be welcomed rather than resisted. That moment came in 797. The blinding, August 797. The conspiracy that removed Constantine VI from power in August 797 was organized and executed by Irene's loyalists within the palace, with her knowledge and almost certainly at her direction. Constantine was seized, brought to the Purple Chamber, the room of imperial births where the porphyry stone floor had given its name to the phrase, "born in the purple," and blinded. The blinding was intended to be severe enough to end his public life entirely. Ancient sources suggest it was so severe that some of his supporters expected him to die from it, and he may have lived for only a short time afterward. The sources are divided on what happened next and on Irene's emotional response to the act she had ordered. Some present her as a calculating ruler who did what political necessity required without visible distress. Others, including later hagiographic accounts that were working toward her canonization, present her as a woman who wept for her son while understanding that she had no alternative. Neither account is entirely trustworthy. What is certain is that she ordered the blinding, that it happened, and that she took the title of emperor, in the masculine form, immediately afterward. The theological paradox of her canonization has been noted by historians ever since. The Eastern Orthodox Church canonized her as a defender of icon veneration. Her restoration of images after decades of iconoclast persecution was a genuine service to the Church, and her convening of the Second Council of Nicaea was a genuine theological achievement. But she also blinded her son. The Church's solution was essentially to treat the blinding as a political act in a political context, deplorable by any ordinary moral standard, but not the defining fact of a life evaluated primarily by its service to Christian theology. Whether this judgment is satisfying is a question each reader has to answer for themselves. The Charlemagne proposal. One of the most extraordinary episodes of Irene's sole reign was the proposal, reported in Frankish sources and alluded to in Byzantine ones, that Charlemagne and Irene might marry, uniting the Eastern and Western empires under a single crown. The context was the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800. An act that Byzantium considered an outrage, since the title of Roman emperor was, in Byzantine understanding, held by the ruler in Constantinople and was not the pope's to give to a Frankish king. Irene's position as a woman ruling alone, without a male co-emperor, created a legal anomaly that the Frankish court exploited in their justification for Charlemagne's coronation. If there was no emperor in Constantinople, only an empress. Perhaps the imperial title was effectively vacant and could be claimed in the West. The marriage proposal, if it was made seriously, would have resolved this by producing a single imperial couple ruling both halves of the former Roman world, a scenario without precedent since the division of the empire 2 centuries earlier. The proposal was apparently under active negotiation when Irene was overthrown in the palace coup of 802. The coup ended the marriage scheme, ended Irene's reign, and ended the last realistic possibility of reunifying the Roman imperial tradition under a single ruler. Whether the marriage would actually have happened, whether Irene would have accepted subordination to Charlemagne, or whether she envisioned something more equal, is a question the sources do not answer. The possibility itself was remarkable enough. Exile and death. The coup of October 802 was organized by treasury officials who had grown impatient with Irene's financial generosity. She had reduced taxes significantly in an effort to maintain popular support, and who feared the consequences of the Charlemagne marriage negotiations for Byzantine autonomy. They elevated Nikephoros I, the finance minister, to the throne, and Irene was exiled to the island of Lesbos. She died there in 803, less than a year after her exile. She had spent her final months reportedly weaving for her own support, a detail that her hagiographers interpreted as a sign of humility, the empress reduced to ordinary labor, bearing her fate with Christian composure. Whether this is literally true or a pious embellishment, the image of the woman who had blinded her son to take his throne spending her last months at a loom is one of history's more striking ironies. Her canonization by the Eastern Orthodox Church occurred in the centuries following her death, driven primarily by her role in the restoration of icon veneration. The feast day assigned to her, August 9, is still observed in the Orthodox calendar. She is venerated alongside her husband Leo IV as a saint, a pairing that requires the Church to treat as equally holy a man who pursued iconoclasm and a woman who reversed it, a convenience that theologians have resolved in various ways without entirely satisfying anyone. What Irene accomplished was, by any measure, historically significant, the restoration of image veneration that had been the dominant theological controversy in Byzantine Christianity for 60 years. The convening of the last ecumenical council recognized by both Catholic and Orthodox traditions, the first solo female rule of the Byzantine Empire, and the opening of diplomatic possibilities with the Frankish West that, had they been pursued, might have altered the subsequent history of Europe. That she achieved all of this through methods that included the political assassination of her son's reign and the physical destruction of his capacity to reclaim it is the uncomfortable truth that her hagiographers have always had to navigate. She was, in the fullest sense, a Byzantine, someone for whom theology and power were not separate categories, and for whom the defense of the true faith justified the full range of instruments available to a ruler who believed the defense to be genuine.